Okay, so we're beginning on Unit 3 of AP Environmental Science, which is all about populations and how they grow and what limits them, both environmentally, ecologically, and human populations. So let's go ahead and jump in, and we will talk first about environmental populations. Maybe. Here we go. Okay, so let's talk about populations. Before we jump into talking about what makes populations grow and change, we're going to quickly review the idea of generalist and specialist species. So hopefully you'll remember that a generalist species is a species that can eat a wide variety of foods and which can live in a wide variety of environments. And a specialist species is one that has either a restricted set of growth conditions in terms of its environment, or which is very specific about the food source that it eats. Uh, this means that specialists are much more likely to become extinct because if their particular food source goes away or if the environment changes in such a way that they can no longer survive, they are likely to become extinct. And generalists are much more likely to be invasive species if they are introduced to a new area because they generally reproduce quickly and have an ability to eat a lot of different types of foods and live in a wide variety of environments. Okay, so that's out of the way. Let's talk about this idea of life history strategies. So the idea of the life history strategy is proposed originally by an ecologist named Robert MacArthur and a biologist named Edward Wilson. So you'll sometimes hear this called the MacArthur-Wilson life history strategies. So when we talk about life history, we're talking about that series of events from birth through reproduction and into death. So when we talk about the life history of a frog, we're talking about it hatching from an egg, becoming a tadpole, emerging as a frog, reproducing, and then eventually dying. So when we talk about strategies for life history, what we're really talking about is reproductive strategies in a large part. So these strategies influence the growth rate of a population. Generally speaking, the age of first reproduction is very important to how quickly a population grows, as is the number of offspring each individual can have, the amount of parental care given to those offspring, and how much energy it takes in order to reproduce. So, obviously, if an organism is young at its age of first reproduction, that's going to make it be able to have more litters or more young during its lifespan, which means that it's going to have a higher, that particular species is going to have a higher growth rate. A high number of offspring is also going to increase the growth rate of a population. The amount of parental care given to offspring, well, as you provide more care, that takes more energy. That actually is going to slow down the growth rate of a population. And energy cost of reproduction. So if an organism can reproduce easily and without investing a lot of its own energy, then that's also going to increase growth rate. So what shapes these life history strategies? Evolution, operating through natural selection. So every population is going to have a life history strategy that's adapted to its particular environment. So we'll see lots of different life history strategies, but we can categorize them into two main categories. The first one is what we call R-selected strategies or R-selected strategists. R-selected strategists put a lot of energy into reproduction. So their evolutionary strategy, remember, evolution is for the population to survive, not for an individual to survive. And so um, by having lots of young, putting lots of energy into reproduction, they are not putting a lot of energy into survival, which means that they tend to be poor competitors. But they are opportunists. That means that they take advantage of favorable conditions and changes in the environment. That also means that when those favorable conditions change, the population is likely to crash. So we're going to see these go through unstable cycles very often. So our selected strategists tend to um, have population spikes when conditions are favorable, and then population crashes when conditions are unfavorable. So also about our selected, some of the characteristics of our selected species, these tend to be small animals. They also tend to reproduce when they're young. They have a lot of offspring because very few of their offspring actually survive to adulthood. They tend to offer little or no parental care. When the conditions are favorable, we tend to see exponential growth in our selected strategists. That's actually why we call them R selected, because R is the factor for exponential growth. They thrive in unpredictable environments, and they are controlled by density independent factors, meaning that it's not about how many of them are there, but it tends to more be broader conditions that control their size. And later on, we're going to talk about survivorship curves. So generally speaking, most R selected species exhibit a type 3 survivorship curve. So what are some examples of R selected species? Oysters are a great example of R selected species. They have lots and lots and lots of young, very few of which actually survive, and they provide no parental care. Bacteria are another great example of R selected species. Again, they reproduce very, very quickly. There's no parental care. Same thing with algae. Most annual plants, it's hard to think about plants as having a R selected or K selected, but if you think about an annual plant, it spreads lots and lots and lots of seeds, but there's no care for those seeds, no protection on those seeds. Dandelions are a great example. Most insects, including cockroaches, tend to be R selected species. They lay thousands of eggs, provide no parental care, and just hope that they survive. And of course, when it comes to mammals, the rodents are the prime example of R selected species. If you think about a mouse, it reproduces within the first 6 months of its life. It can have a litter of 8 to 10, and once they can open their eyes and move, there's no parental care involved. Okay, at the other end of the spectrum is what we call K-selected species. So K-selected species put their energy into long-term survival. They tend to give high levels of parental care, and they are good competitors. They do thrive best in ecosystems with fairly constant environmental conditions, and their populations remain close to carrying capacity over long periods of time. So again, R for exponential growth, K for carrying capacity. So what are some of the characteristics of K-selected species? These tend to be larger bodied animals. They reproduce late in life. They don't have a lot of offspring, and they provide high levels of parental care. Most of their offspring survive because of those high levels of parental care. They tend to live in predictable environments. They are controlled by density dependent factors. So this means that the larger that their population gets, the more limiting factors there are going to be. And again, we haven't talked yet about survivorship curves, but when we get to those, most K-selected species are on the type 1 survivorship curve. So of course, when we think of examples of this, we immediately jump to humans and large mammals. We can also think of trees as K-selected species, not because they provide parental care, but because they don't reproduce very often. And those that do survive tend to have long lives. Okay, so R selected and K selected. Now let's talk about survivorship curves. So survivorship curves show mortality rather than as a function of age, as a function of the percentage of the average lifespan. There are three curve types: type 1, type 2, and type 3. So let's look at an example. So here we have a survivorship curve. You'll notice that it has a number of survivors here on the y-axis. Here it's telling us that this is on a logarithmic scale. And you notice that on the x-axis, it gives us age in relative units. You will frequently see this as a percentage of lifespan. So when we look at a type 1 survivorship curve, you can see that the vast majority of the individuals of this species survive until very close to a full lifespan. So this means that most of the young survive, most of the middle-aged survive, and it's not until we approach old age that we start to see the percentage or the population decline. On the other end of the spectrum, we have type 3. And type 3, you see that most of the population dies before reaching adulthood. Those that do reach adulthood tend to live a long time, percentage of their lifespan at least. But the vast majority don't make it to adulthood. So this is organisms that have a high mortality rate in juveniles. So again, when we think about rodents or wildflowers, most of them, wildflowers never implant and grow. Many rodents lose a lot of their young before they reach adulthood. And then we have type 2. And type 2 are those where the mortality is independent of percentage of lifespan. And so they have a relatively constant mortality rate throughout their lifespan. And birds are usually the classic example of type 2 survivorship curves, simply because they're relatively consistent throughout their lives. Please recognize that type 1, type 2, type 3 R selected, K selected. These are not black and white. Most species fall somewhere on the spectrum, and particularly when it comes to R and K, some can be exceptionally difficult to categorize. Okay, so that covers it. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.